All right, Nick Coury, welcome back to the Single Track Podcast.
Yeah, good to be back.
So I'm going to be long-winded here for a moment because the last time you were here on the show, you were coming off Desert Solstice. You had just set the 24-hour record on the American side, and we spent a lot of time talking about your philosophy of negative splitting when it comes to race strategy. So if listeners have not checked that one out, we'll link to it in the show notes, and there's going to be much more of a discussion there. But I'm bringing it back up here again because you published a race report a little bit after we recorded that episode, and there's a quote I want to touch on before we get into Javelina stuff. You say, and I'm going to read it here, quote, "The best runners in the world show clear potential early on, and if they're going to make it big, they do it within a couple of years. I'd already pushed my limits for well over a decade, and I was plateauing away from anything notable, or so I thought," end quote. And I loved reading that. And obviously things have changed, but can you go into a bit more detail about what you said there? And I think I want to talk about it because it brings up one of the most interesting aspects of our sport where runners are able to kind of reinvent themselves on the fly at any point. So maybe dig into it a little bit more and like kind of tell the audience what you were thinking there.
Yeah, I think I don't want to just say used to, but it's almost a truism that if someone's going to be, world class, because people even ask me, I set the American record, am I going to go after the world record? And they say that with good intentions, but also the world record's 25 miles beyond. And yeah, sure, maybe I could improve a lot, but that is almost certainly physically impossible, biologically impossible. There are differences. Not everyone is capable of breaking the world record, 6 billion people or whatever. And so I try to understand where I'm at, both from what should I be aiming for and pushing for realistically, but also being unrealistic has its own consequences. But for a long time, I assumed that I wasn't capable of being the best in the world or even the best in the country. And I was even reflecting on this earlier this week coincidentally enough, that I looked back and I think it was 5 or 6 years of doing ultras before I won my first ultra. And wow. It was 15 years before I won a 100-mile, 24-hour. And so I think that highlights kind of what I mean is we're used to you have a Jim Walmsley or an Alexander Sorokin or a Killian, and that they're going to be good. And it might take them a couple years to get there, but even in those first years, they're rising fast. They're already doing really well at some prominent races. And, I tried and I trained and I improved, and I was still nowhere near that. I would go to any of these races and it's someone else is clearly going to beat me, clearly better. And I had to constantly push against the idea that maybe I just haven't figured it out, or I just have to keep getting better and better. But we all know we kind of plateau at various points, and there's always the question, is that the final plateau, or is there some other breakthrough you can come through? And so my career has basically been convincing myself over and over again that plateau isn't the final one.
Right on. Well, it seems like the last year has been a bit of a whirlwind for you, at least in the first 4 or 5 months post-Desert Solstice. You were dealing with some injuries, and I was impressed. You did Hardrock on pretty minimal training, but you seem like you are cresting right now and things are clicking. Can you give some insight into how you've been training for Javelina and how you're feeling about it roughly a week out?
Yeah, so Hardrock, I made my coach so nervous at so many points because it was clear the whole spring was a wash, and I had a bunch of not good training and not good miles and constantly struggling with injury, and finally broke down and got PRP, which if you're not familiar, is platelet-rich plasma injections. They take your blood out, they spin it down, and they inject your own healing factors at your site of injury. And I've had it once before and it worked great then, and this time I think it even works better. And so my Achilles heel bursa issues, 5 weeks out from Hardrock, I got this injection. I was in a boot on crutches for 2 weeks, had basically 2 more weeks to try to get just something worth of fitness in, and then taper down. And yeah, Hardrock went as good as I could have possibly hoped for that. Obviously my base fitness kicked in, but that gets me so far. It got me pretty far. It didn't get me all the way. I kind of faded the last 20, but rolled through uninjured, which was more than I expected. and then bounced right into like, I'm like, I have this in my head that I want to do Javelina, or I should say I did at the beginning of the year. And then I convinced myself that would be an awful idea because even if I got through Hardrock, that wouldn't be enough time. But I tend to want to try those kind of things anyways. And so I've been extremely cautious the whole way, like ready to throw in the towel if like the training is too stressful or I start getting injured. But I was up to a 100-mile week in 2 weeks after Hardrock, and then have just basically held it the whole time. So I'm cramming, which obviously is very risky, and I understand those risks. Yeah. But I focused on endurance early on and getting the miles up and getting the body used to that just repetitive stress again. And then these last like few weeks to a month, I've really been able to focus on speed and get that in. So like I'm definitely nowhere near as fit as I was at the end of last year. I can tell with my heat workouts, like it's just not quite at the same level, but I'm still getting pretty fit. I'm feeling that magic starting to come back, and it's enough that I'm willing to throw my hat in the ring at Javelina. I know the field is pretty stout. A couple of those guys on their best days, I don't think I will match their like fastest times. You know, if Pat Regan's running a 13 flat, I don't think I'll be with him. But I don't think I need to be because I've got the rest of the stuff going for me. Like it's my home course, like the heat, the hotter it is, the better it is for me. And I know from that race, both because I've run it and I've watched it, you know, countless years, most of those guys are going to fall apart. And it's just a question. If they fall apart enough, I'll be passing them laps 4, lap 5.
Very interesting. Well, yeah, you ran this race back in 2020. I think you finished in 14:09, second overall, just behind Tim Tollefson. Can you compare the day that you had back in 2020 to the one that you think you're capable of having this time around? Like, I guess I'm wondering, do you think for yourself, even if you don't see yourself running 13 flat, do you see time to shave off? And I'm curious about that.
Yeah, like definitely that's probably the upper bound of what I would expect. That I think I'm about as fit, if not a little more fit than I was 2 years ago. And also 2 years ago, that was really just a training run for Desert Solstice at the time. So I didn't give it 100%. I went out a little slower. Like I went out really slow relative to, it was like a 5% negative split. I think it was 45 minutes faster the second half. And I just hammered the last 2 laps. And so it was too far negative, I would say, to be optimal. And this, I'm actually going to like legit race, see how I can place against all these guys. Now there's the golden ticket on the line, which is exciting. And I'd love to sneak in for that. So yeah, I'd say definitely I should be sub 14. And then it's a question of how deep into the 13s I can go.
Are you able to say what time you're targeting at the halfway point to set up a negative split?
I usually keep that close to the chest, but I feel like it will be no secret, like a lap in, because you'll see my average pace. Like I'm shooting for 13:45. And then, yeah, like depending on how I feel at halfway, I'll either maintain or hopefully be able to crank it down a little.
I want to reference one more quote from your Desert Solstice race report. You say, "I like competing at big races to remind myself just how far off I am. I can compete against Walmsley, Sorokin, Bitter, and will not even be a footnote compared to their typical performances," end quote. In the case of Javelina, do you feel like you belong in contention here?
I do at this race. And going back to, I think the heat especially, like 2 years ago, I nailed every aspect of like the logistics of the race, you could say. You know, people are used to going there and it's, you know, upper 80s, some years it's even low 90s, and people just melt down. Like the blowups are incredible. And at the front of the pack, that's because you're barely getting out of the heat before you finish. And like mid and back of the pack, the thing that people don't expect is the temperature out there swings like 50 plus degrees. And so you get roasted all day. And then through the night, when in theory, it's like perfect running, it's awesome. You can't move fast enough to generate heat and you start going hypothermic, which is like bizarre because, you know, 6 hours earlier, you're getting heat stroke. And so like this race in particular, it's like people think of it as like an easy 100 or a first 100 or a fast 100. And those can be true. But what's maybe more true is that like the heat management and the temperature management and like the subtleties of the course, there's no cover. You're just getting hammered with the sun all day. You know, that the desert, like dry lack of humidity really changes some things, changes how, the temperature feels and logistics work. And so like when you add that in, it's not just about how fast you can run. It's about the total race management. And, clearly that's one of my strengths is managing all the little details. And so 2 years ago, like I felt chilly for most of the race as it's hitting, mid to upper 80s because I'm doing so much heat mitigation. And so, with that in there, like I think I can run with the best. As I said, I'm not in my absolute lifetime peak fitness, but if I was, I think I could do as good as anyone out there.
I just have 2 more questions for you. Assuming things fall into place for you and a golden ticket is there in your lap, is Western States a race that interests you? And could you see yourself lining up for it next year? I mean, just as from a fan standpoint, your negative splitting philosophy would fascinate me applied to that course.
Yeah, that's actually the reason why I wanted to race Javelina this year and why I took the risk of cramming all this training is every year I watch Western States and I watch the epic blow-ups in the second half. And all I can think is like, I would love to see what I can do out there because I think I could do something way better than what everyone seems to. But again, you don't know until you actually try it. Maybe it's hard in a different way than I anticipate, and that wouldn't be the case. Or maybe it'll totally work and I'll go out there and be like, yeah, like I'm going to change how people think about this race.
Lastly, in addition to negative splitting, you're famous for your shoe choice. I think you wore road shoes at Hardrock. And for all the shoe heads out there, what are you lacing up with on race day?
This is a trade secret. You'll have to wait and see.
Awesome. Well, Nick, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. We're looking forward to watching your race unfold roughly a week from today. And thanks again. Best of luck.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.